Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. Kurt Meyer of the 12th SS was an infamous commander in Normandy, responsible for some truly despicable war crimes. His trial a year later was also infamous. Well, now there's only one person to discuss this with. Tim Cook devotes a chunk of his super book, The Fight to History, for this series of events. There's my copy of the book there. The link to purchase it is in the description below. It doesn't just cover that. Well, we can maybe talk about that with Tim in a minute, but it discusses all sorts of things about Canada's role, and we can get to that later on. But I'll bring Tim in now. Good afternoon. How are you today?
I'm great, Paul. Great to be back. Thank you.
So this is a hot one, isn't it? I mean, we were just saying that the interest in the 12th SS doesn't go away. The interest in Kurt Meyer doesn't go away. When did you first become aware of the story?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And great to be back. And hello, everyone. I encountered this over 30 years ago, Paul, when I was a young student at the National Archives, which is our National Archives in Ottawa. And I had a job for about a week going through the autopsy files. Now, these were the files that documented the war crimes. As we will get into, those Canadians who were executed at the Abbaye d'Ardenne. And it was pretty ghastly stuff for a young guy. I don't know how old I was, 22 or something. I had an interest and had been studying military history, but this really captured my imagination as well as turning my stomach. And it's not like I sat down and began to write books on that. It took many, many years. But this story has been a part of, it's a part of Canadian military history. It's a part of the fighting in Normandy. It's a part of the legacy of war. And so when I wrote my 2-volume history on the Second World War, I included it there. And the book that you mentioned, which is really the 3rd volume on the memory of the war, the fight for history, it seemed to fit in there. And maybe we'll come back to that and talk about that a bit later. But I think it's a powerful story that goes beyond the Canadian one, as I think we'll talk about today, and hopefully fits nicely into your great series here.
And thank you. And there's Kurt Meyer's photos up there. Now, there's been lots of debates in the war and currently about what is a real Nazi. I mean, he absolutely is everything that we think about when we think about Nazis. I mean, just fervently believer. Give us a sort of thumbnail sketch of who this guy is. Yeah,
I imagine many of your watchers here know of his reputation, but you're right. He was an early member of the Nazis. He was part of the Waffen SS. He was a tough, effective soldier. Everybody said that. He had fought through the Polish campaign and received a gallantry award. He fought on the Eastern Front multiple times in countless battles. Sometimes his fighting formations surrounded. He's leading the breakout. One superior described him as having a fanatical combat spirit. And so this is a soldier, and yet he is brutal on the Eastern Front. While the documentation is not the same on the Eastern Front, widely attributed atrocities to him in killing civilians, men, women, and children. And that savage war on the Eastern Front, which we know so well and which fascinates us and horrifies us, it truly shaped him, as I think it did so many who served there. And so he comes back to the Western Front, and that's where the Canadians will encounter him.
Yeah. And we'll get to the Canadians in a second, but the 12th SS, I mean, they're a perfect mix of everything that is shit about the Nazis, aren't they? They've got the hardcore guys who've been through the Eastern Front, as you say, who, if they had any sense of humanity, it's been long since beaten out of them by just the brutality of that campaign. And then you've got, the 18-year-old newbies who are in there, who are everything that has been created out of the Third Reich, the Nazis, I don't like using the word brainwashed, but fervent and loyal and part of the ideology. So it's a perfect storm of jaded, cynical leadership and eager young recruits given pretty damn good tanks and thrust into the Normandy campaign.
Yeah, I think you've captured it nicely there. This cadre of NCOs and a very smattering small group of officers who are forged in that cauldron of fire on the Eastern Front. And then all of these young guys, I mean, the milk bottle division, they sometimes called them because they were so young. Well, they're not so young. They're 16, 17, 18. But what I have always found challenging here, as did some Canadian soldiers, was just how young they were and how they were indoctrinated from birth. I mean, we're talking 44 here. Their whole lives, they have been fed this evil ideology. Are they guilty? Well, who knows? But they are certainly bloodthirsty. They generally don't take prisoners. They are a force that Kurt Meyer and others senior officers wheeled into this effective fighting formation, and they're about up to full strength on the Western Front. They've suffered some casualties from air power, but not a lot. About 17,000 strong and about 200 tanks, and so they are with 21st Panzer and others, part of the main counterattacking force for the 6th and the 7th of June 1944.
And then meanwhile, we'll get the map there of Juno Beach inland. You have the Canadians who are going to be up against him, the 3rd Division, mostly green, lots and lots of training in the UK, volunteers, lots of regimental sort of tradition there, lots of patriotism, lots of, I suppose, keenness to fight this war the correct way. If there is a correct way to fight a global war, would that sum up the attitude of the 3rd Canadian Division?
Yeah, I think you're right. They haven't gone into battle. Your watchers will know that, of course, 1st Canadian Division fighting through Sicily from July of 43, and then the Italian Boot and other formations joining there. 2nd Division bloodied at Dieppe in August of 42 and later to come into Normandy. But this is a trial by fire for the Canadians. And of course, as your map nicely shows there, and everybody here knows, the Canadians have Juno Beach and storm that with the Allies, the British on either side, and the Americans further down. Command of the air is important here. The naval guns are absolutely crucial. But the Canadians make it off those beaches. They drive forward, and I won't go into that detail. You've had Mark Milner on and Mike Bechtold and other great historians. I think it's important to say that for the survivors of that day, which is most of the division, as we know only too well from the British and the Americans as well, there's great chaos on those beaches and trying to get the guys off and to push inland. And so the Canadians are really moving towards Caen is hopefully will be captured on their left flank, but they're also hoping to get the Carpiquet airfield, again, to create this space to allow that air power in. And we know that that will be a fight that goes on really for the next month. But yes, they're advancing. And I think it's important to know they're advancing without really knowing what's in front of them, right? You and I know we have a map in front of them. They don't have this map. These are guys who can only see what is in front of them. And so the letters and diaries, which I use in my books, which are so important, those oral histories and talking to veterans, many of them talk about this. Tim, I never saw Juno Beach again. I remember one guy telling me, and I thought, geez, isn't that something? Yeah, of course. We talk so much about Juno Beach. He never got back there. And he was lucky to survive. He came back, I think it was the 40th anniversary, 1984. But most of the Canadians are pushing south to contact. And of course, contact will be with the 12th SS.
And I always make the point when I'm people on the ground there is that you can see the confidence sort of rising on the 7th of June. Things have more or less gone to plan on the 6th across the front there. And as they push inland, the 9th Brigade particularly, and they tick off the towns or the villages, and Villeneuve-Buisson and then Buron. And I'm sure that at that time they must have been thinking, well, Caen by lunchtime, Berlin by next week. And they have really only encountered the second grade troops on the first day. And there is that, as you said, not that much knowledge about the 12th SS and where they are, and indeed their ability to bloody the nose of units coming towards them. So what, we need to set the scene now about where Kurt Meyer now comes into it, between the 6th and the 7th, and what is now lying ahead of the Canadians on the 7th.
Yeah, and Kurt Meyer here is a colonel. He's 34 years old. He's commanding 25th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, so one of the two. And he has moved into the Abbaye d'Ardenne, and that will be an important site for us. It's an old monastery. I know you've taken multiple tours there. We'll talk about that at the end. It's a key area, and it allows a pretty incredible view of the battlefield here, which is remarkably flat in places, a real kill ground. And Meyer, because of this idea of Panzer Meyer, fast Meyer, attack, 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 right? He can see the Canadians, literally see them coming off Juno Beach, advancing towards Carpiquet Airfield. They're only 3, 4, 5 kilometers out of Caen here. And this is happening in real time. Again, it's useful to come back to that idea that this is moving fast. The Canadians are driving German forces in front of them back, but they are ready for that counterattack. They know it's coming, and it does come. And Meyer redirects his fighting force and sends 2 of his 3 battalions and about 50 tanks into the open flank of the North Nova Scotia Highlanders and the Sherbrooke Fusiliers, who are on Shermans. And they're in Oti and Biron, and you'd mentioned those small towns there. And you look at this on a map, if you were wargaming this, and you go, what's happening on the left flank here? How can this happen? Because they're wide open. And the Germans attack. And about 2 o'clock, they start coming over ground. They're supported by strong artillery support, shelling from 21st Panzer Division. And we've got Shermans versus Mark IVs. And this is a bloody fight, breaking down, battlefield covered in smoke and chaos. And the Germans hit the Canadians hard. They badly maul one of the companies for the Highlanders. The battle goes on for about 3 to 4 hours, and the Canadians are driven back. And there's some incredible stories here of, at one point, the Shermans are forced to retreat. They find a group of Highlanders are surrounded. They turn around, go back into battle to help break them out. I mean, this is not a rout by any means, but the Canadians were overextended. And that's the key point. And one of the key elements here, going back to that original point of Juno Beach and the chaos there, is that most of the Canadian anti-tank guns have not made it off the beach. And they need those to help stop the Mark IVs. And so the Canadians are bloodied. They're pushed back. They lose about 21 Shermans, about 200 casualties to the North Novas. And the Germans lose about the same number. But of course, in battle, as you attack and hold the ground, there are a whole number of wounded soldiers. And we know that about 24 Canadians are killed there on the battlefield, executed, likely wounded, and others are then taken prisoner back to the Abbaye d'Ardenne.
Yeah, and just to summarize, I mean, it's like the Villa-Bocage debacle of a week later. There's 2 halves of the battle. There's the Germans getting the upper hand half, and then there's the second half, which is what Mark Milner makes the big point about, as when you carry on the rest of the day and even into the 8th of June, the balance of power does probably shift in favor of the Canadians, as it does the Brits at Villa-Bocage, as I said, 6 days later. But nevertheless, in those first few hours, you said that the point is there are Canadians being taken swiftly back to the Abbaye d'Ardenne. And that's where the ensuing executions have. So take us through that, because as we're finding in these war crime shows, there's very little doubt that these crimes were committed. That's never the issue. It's not like they're not certain if it ever occurred. They've got that. So take us through that, if you would.
Yeah, it goes back to some of that archival evidence I was telling you about 30 years ago as a student going through those files. Those autopsies revealed executions. They could tell. Hands were bound, bullets to the back of the head. But there's a story there, of course. But it's a murky story because, as we will later get to, the Panzer Division is wiped out in Normandy. So there aren't a lot of eyewitness survivors. And in fact, almost all the Canadians are killed who are involved in this. So this is part of the trial. But what we do know, of course, is prisoners were brought back there. Kurt Meyer is there. He surveys the battlefield. He sees that his force has driven the Canadians back, but they're not able to drive on to Juno Beach. And so, that famous saying of we're gonna hurl these small fish back into the sea, it doesn't happen. Those small fish have teeth. And on the other flank, the Canadians, as you've alluded to, they fight, hold their ground. And really, these are key days. But for Canadians who are captured at the Abbaye d'Ardenne, they're brought there, they're interrogated. Some seem to have talked, some refuse and give name, serial number. And this is where it is. So some of those soldiers, what we do know is that they were led one by one to an area away from others and executed, a bullet to the back of the head. At least 18, possibly more. They were buried in shallow graves. And one of the things that has always profoundly shaken me, and I'll try to say it without choking up, is that those Canadians knew their fate. And they shook hands with one another and they said good luck, and they hoped that one of them would get out. What's confusing about this is, like you said, not that this happened. It did, but not every prisoner was executed.
Well, we had those questions coming in, Tim. Is why did the Germans execute some and not others? And then Adam said, has there been a definitive answer as to why these Canadians were murdered? Because some were taken off to conventional prisoner of war camps, and so
this will come into the trial.
Sort of selection process, isn't there?
That's right. So it's not that the Highlanders from Nova Scotia, one of the maritime provinces, were more bloodthirsty and therefore executed or not. There appears no rhyme or reason to it. And let me, if we can just park those questions for a second, we'll come back to that, because it's part of the trial too. Because one of the things that the Canadians try to prove in the trial is that Kurt Meyer had said to his soldiers, no prisoners. Why are you bringing prisoners here? They're just going to eat our food. In effect, we don't need these guys. And so, was it a stray statement? Was it something stupid he said, tired, exhausted? There are too many executions, I would argue, to show that it was just one case or another. And we'll get to that. In fact, there are 156 documented executions, and they're all over the battlefield. And let's come back, Paul, to some of these questions, because they are terrific. But one of the ones we should try to decipher a bit is there a difference in the mind of the people watching here of prisoners who are killed in the heat of battle, for instance, trying to surrender? There's a machine gun still firing over there. There's a rifleman over there. It's chaos. Adrenaline is going. Your buddy has just been shot. You decide, I'm not wasting time on this prisoner. That's not this case, right? These happen hours later. The battle is already won by the Germans. And so let's come back to that, because I think it's worth talking about. And it may tie into some of your other war crime discussions, except to say that these Canadians were executed and buried there.
I mean, this is the difference. We talked about Joachim Peiper and the SS racing through in the Ardennes last week, and their justification was they're in a race to get through to Antwerp, and therefore that was the most expedient way, is to get rid of the 84 men of the Field Artillery Observation Battalion. But what this is distinctive about the Abbaye d'Ardenne, and indeed the Chateau Ordieu down the road, other ones, is there's this almost gleeful and slowing down of it. They're not trying to do it. There's a the delay they take between shooting people is clearly, what it seems to me, built to increase the horror of it, to increase the fear of the people you're going to get to murder. Which suggests they're not under pressure, under time constraints.
They are definitely not. This is hours later, sometimes a day later. So we can't say it's adrenaline pumping or what have you. I suppose you could say it's straight revenge. You can't even say that in some battlefields, when you are forced into a retreat, I mean, are you going to drag those prisoners with you? Are you going to allot manpower to guard them? That is at least a case that one might say could happen. But no, this is, as you said, slow murder. And frankly, Paul, what is sad is the wrong word, terrifying, I suppose, is taking them off one at a time. You could have put them all against the wall and machine gunned them. And so there's something quite deliberate about that, and awful. And these men, these Canadians, we talk about the young Hitler youth, but some of these Canadians are 20, 21, and 22. Yeah. They're not much older, are they? So we're talking young men here, and they are executed there. And the Canadians don't initially know this. They do know about some of their prisoners who are executed on other fronts here. Because the Canadians are overrun several times, although they go into sort of a hedgehog position, hold the front, and then counterattack. And they have seen all over the battlefield that their comrades are being executed, and sometimes their bodies, and this is grim stuff, folks, I apologize, being mutilated, driving tanks over them over and over again. So there is something beyond, if one was to make the argument, this is the heat of battle, Tim, settle down. You don't understand what the soldiers faced here. Well, fair enough, I don't, except I do know that it is not that case.
And as you say, that the Canadians don't know about it as such, but there are rumors. There's the Royal Artillery officer in Oti who gets back from the church there. There's the padre who goes missing down the road at Galmanche, who ends up being murdered. So it's starting to get back to the Canadians, and indeed the British, that these guys are not the same as the line troops we were finding in the Vie de Stanzes on the beaches. And so before we go back to Kurt Meyer and the trial, we should just sort of address the fact that there is a little bit of it's a bit of a grudge match over the next few weeks between the Canadians and the 12th SS is sort of understating it a bit. I mean, and people have talked about it. Brad has talked about it on OTD Military History. It becomes quite a, there's more than just combat involved.
There's hatred here, I think, and one can understand it. And of course, the fighting, only too well. It's a slow, grinding warfare through June. Carpiquet Airfield in early July, 4th of July. Caen on the 8th, 9th, 10th. And then, of course, by that point, 12th SS has pulled back as the Germans are pulling out of Caen and moving south. And so they're leaving the battlefield and the debris of the battlefield and the bodies on the battlefield. And as you say, these rumors are becoming, there is evidence, and the way stories move, they begin to understand this. And it even makes its way up to the high command. General Harry Criar, Canada's first Canadian Army commander, he has to issue an order in early August saying, do not surrender. Surrender means death. Now that is, I've never seen an order like that in Canadian military history ever. But he also warns the Canadians not to seek vengeance. And I think that's important. That indicates a couple of things. One, I'm pretty sure it indicates the Canadians have already sought vengeance. They are already killing prisoners. There's oral histories. There are guys saying we didn't take prisoners for a long time, especially the 12th SS. Now, there's a difference between saying that and doing that, Paul. And one of the great Canadian soldiers, Charlie Martin, who wrote a great war diary, he said he too was fired up. He was going to take no prisoner, but when he had this kid in front of him, he didn't shoot him. He couldn't. He could not execute him in cold blood. Now, I'm pretty sure not all Canadians felt that way. But what we are seeing here through July, through August, is almost head-to-head battles, time and time again, between the Canadians and 12th SS and other formations, with the air power support moving out of the range of the guns. And we won't refight Normandy here because we got to get to the trial. But by the end of Normandy, the closing of Falaise Gap, 12th SS is largely annihilated. They're down to about 500 soldiers. Kurt Meyer, nobody knows where he is. He flees as well. And bizarrely, he's captured in early September by a Belgian farmer or something like that. They're going to hand him over to the resistance, who are going to execute him, but he sort of alerts them to who he is, and he is captured. He's a high target intelligence. And then maybe we know how the battles and the fighting will go on here. Maybe we can move to the end of the war, this hard-fought, bloody victory. And here we are. Yeah.
And we the first show in this series we did with Guy Walters about the list that begins to be drawn up in 43. And I think eventually 60,000 names that the Allies identified of people they want. And clearly Kurt Meyer is for Canadians and for Brits, he's going to be, pretty near the top of this list, of which there are a lot of despicable people there. Yeah. And, one of the things we discussed with Guy is this, and other historians, is that, unfortunately, barely 10% of Nazis ever got to face any kind of justice, or they either died in the war, they escaped, they fled, whatever. So Meyer does face due process, and that's what we're going to move into now, and pretty damn swiftly, isn't it? It's really pretty early. It's a year later, he's facing things. So tell us about the beginning of the trial process and what he's charged with, how's the trial set up, etc.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So the trial starts, just to frame that for everyone, on the 10th of December in Orich. It was a small German town by the North Sea. But before that, of course, the Canadians have been laying the case, gathering evidence. They knew they wanted Kurt Meyer. They had him. They had interrogated him. I've read those transcripts. They're really interesting. Meyer, as you can imagine, is evasive and stony and not really answering questions. But he can tell pretty quickly they're trying to get him for murdering Canadians, and he's denying that throughout. A great image there, Kurt Meyer in the middle. This is in the trial itself. So the Canadians are building a case, and they have a prosecution team. And like you said, this also happens within the Nuremberg trials, which start in late November. So the Canadian trial is only 2 weeks later. It's the only war crime trial the Canadians engage in on their own. They're pinning everything on this. The Canadian government, which is really does, it's afraid, and they're not sure they want to be involved in this. They would prefer the Allies took care of Kurt Meyer through the Nuremberg trials, but they were never going to get to that level of Nazi, as you've already said. So it becomes the Canadians, and they are looking for evidence. And so they have the forensic evidence. They have the evidence of the 156 dead, which seems to create a pattern, but they don't have a lot of eyewitnesses. Why? Because they're all dead. Yeah. So they're traveling to all the prisoner of war camps, and they finally find a 12th SS guy, a conscript from Poland, by the name of Jan Jesenek, who says, yes, we were told to take no prisoners. Now, he's a bit of a dodgy character. He's clearly a sycophant. He's clearly trying to suck up. But they think this is their star witness. Yeah. So the trial begins on the 10th of December. The Canadians have a number of senior generals, major generals, brigadiers, and a lieutenant colonel, all combat veterans. So they've all seen battle. And I wonder, Paul, does that make them more susceptible to wanting revenge? Or is it more that they understand how things are on the battlefield? And that's one of those.
I think it's both. And I think, and it's the timing as well, isn't it? Because I'm as we've been discussing in this, there's also this idea that once VE Day and then VJ Day has occurred, people just want to enjoy it for a bit. Just enjoy the fact we've won the war. And although that doesn't mean people don't want justice, it's like, can we just have a party first for a few months? Can we not start thinking? And this is at the same time the Cold War is brewing. There's all those things happening in Greece and Indochina and everywhere else in the world that looks like it's all just going to be a series of mini world, which it was, more wars. And yet they're already trying to get this thing about justice, which I think is really fascinating. And also what's fascinating is, and this is going to be in all these shows we're doing, in a modern trial, they might try and say, okay, these are the particular crimes we're focusing on, but we must take into consideration these ones 3 years earlier, these ones 2 years earlier, and the fact that he carries on being accused of things into the latter part of the war. But it seems that most of the trials, they think, no, we're going to go for this one set of crimes, which I understand, but I can see there's a bit of faulty logic there.
I think there is, and the Canadians are very much trying to do this by the book. I think they are trying to show that this will not be a victor's justice, even though they are the victors and they are seeking justice, nor do they want it to be seen as a victor's revenge. And so one might argue that they, even overcompensate a little bit. And like you say, framing the trial around, for the most part, the things that they have strong evidence on. So the Canadians killed at the Abbaye d'Ardenne, but not the other places. Some of that evidence eventually is entered in. The prosecuting prosecutor is a Lieutenant Bruce MacDonald. He's a pre-war lawyer. He's a good lawyer. He'd commanded Canadians in battle, the Essex Scottish. And he's built this case. And so, they unfold the case as it reads like something you'd see on TV or a movie. They are bringing up witnesses, and they're building the case. They've got the forensic evidence. And all throughout this, Kurt Meyer, and you see his image here, he is sitting and he is staring down the witnesses. And over again, there's all kinds of journalists covering this because this is big news in Canada and in Britain as well. They all talk about this penetrating stare that he has that begins to melt the witnesses. Like they begin to stammer, they lose themselves. And Bruce MacDonald himself doesn't quite understand what's happening because they are literally collapsing on the stand. Yeah. He realizes Kurt Meyer is giving them some sort of death look. He keeps standing and he learns to stand in between Meyer and the witnesses. So interesting stories like that. But this was covered. This was big news again because the Nuremberg trials are all through this period. So we're attuned to this. Most of the Canadian soldiers and Air Force and others have gone home. Just to remind people, 1.1 million Canadians in uniform. So hundreds of thousands have come back in their communities. And then every single day they are reading about this trial. And there are headlines like this. I'll just read you a few. Yeah. The story of sadism and mental torture was one. Another, Canadian troops shot with their hands up. So these are really graphic accounts of what is being presented here. And this goes on for a while. Eventually, Kurt Meyer is brought to the stand. I should say their star witness, Jesenik, is brought up there. And he's not very good, Paul. He's not good on the stand. He's shifty. He's sweaty. They realize this is not their star witness. So they try to get him off there quickly. They put up Meyer. They hope they can break him in multiple examinations, and nothing. He gives nothing. He says he didn't do it. Soldiers do this in battle. This happens. No orders, and he goes on and on. And so the trial ends. It's Christmas now. The generals deliberate this, and we have some evidence here of them. One of them wrote memoirs, and then there was a history of this. And they're talking about the charges. And we should have said there were 5 charges against Kurt Meyer, from the most significant, which was he ordered his soldiers to take no prisoners, down to the principle of command authority, which is, you're responsible for what the soldiers do underneath you. And that's a new concept. Yeah,
this is the crux of what the legal due process is morphing as the trials are taking place. It's some of the groundwork is being done before the trials, but it's sort of happening. It's like on the job training. They're inventing, and it carries on, as we discussed with the Barbie case, to the 80s. They're still going, okay. I mean, particularly the crimes against humanity, which wasn't a thing and then became a thing.
Yes, and it's fascinating, and you've nicely captured it there. That this is this almost organic process, layered into this victor's justice or victor's revenge, and then this other desire to be fair so that history will understand. And of course, Nuremberg trials, we won't go into that, but fair or not, one thing they did is lay down a record of the Nazi atrocities. That too is a goal here, to give a bit of due justice to those Canadians who were murdered and their families. And eventually, the generals decide that Jesenik was not a convincing witness. They don't believe him. But Meyer is charged with other lesser crimes, of which that one of command responsibility, which comes with the death penalty, at least in this case. And so he is sentenced to death. And, that's a that's what the Canadians were hoping for. So this happens really at the end of December.
And this is when we get to that, again, awkward thing, is that there isn't in these trials a traditional right for appeal. Right. But there is sort of this introspection where they're already, as you're saying, they're making sure that they're double checking that nothing has been done untoward, sort of on an unofficial basis. This is happening it happened with the Piper or the SS for Malmedy trial, where they're going, we really must make sure that this is whiter than white, because we don't want to be compared, maybe years later to the people we're trying. And so they don't carry that. Famously, they don't carry out any of these sentences quickly of any of these people, whether it's in the Tokyo trials or here in Germany. There's this sort of limbo period, and it's during that period that things take some interesting turns.
Yeah, like you couldn't write this if it was a fiction novel. I'm not sure you'd believe it. So he receives the death penalty sentence on the 28th of December. The prosecutor for this, the MacDonald, he actually wrote the rules to the court martial because, as you said nicely, nobody knew how these things are supposed to unfold. And he said that the commanding officer in the theater, a Canadian, had to agree, support the judgment. And that fell to Major General Chris Vokes. And, you've got a great image. Yeah, Vokes.
Yeah, I mean that, talking about you couldn't make a movie, that he's straight out of the British cartoon, The Two Types, isn't it? I mean, the big red, moustache.
He's an infantry commander. He's a basher. He was responsible. He commanded 1st Canadian Division in Italy for the Ortona campaign, which was just hammering in December of 43. Nobody thought he was terribly bright, but he was tough. And he's that kind of a general, perhaps better on the Somme in 1916. Nonetheless, it falls to Vokes, and Vokes is not quite sure what he's supposed to do. So he has some advisors, but eventually he reads through, he does his due diligence. He reads through the tribunal's decision, and eventually he decides, even though he's uncomfortable with the fact that Kurt Meyer will be executed for actions his soldiers do, which he is responsible. So that command responsibility, he feels he has to do it. So he passes the death sentence last day of the year, 31st of December, 1945. Meyer is told he will be executed. And it feels like that's the end of it. But then, strangely, MacDonald, the prosecutor, had written in a second decision from a senior commander, not one, but two. And this is where we're talking about of really trying to make sure they're safe. And the bizarre thing here is they assumed it would be a different theater commander who would offer the second judgment. This is a bit like, think of First World War courts martials that lead to the death sentence that keep working their way up the command and get changed and blocked at certain places. Finally, they get to Hague. So here, they're assuming it will be Guy Simonds, Canada's best fighting general. But because of a quirk of fate, it falls to Vokes again. And he just signed off on this. This is a couple of days later. But he reads through it again, and I guess you'd have to say, he gets cold feet. And so he flies to England to get some better law advice. And again, surprisingly, he's told, I don't think this is a death sentence. He's told by a number of Canadian senior commanders. So he then goes back and commutes Meyer to life in prison. So Meyer is basically told he will be executed. He says goodbye to his family. And then there is this almost miraculous 2 minutes to midnight decision to save his life. And you can imagine the outrage in Canada over this. Yeah. And people are just going bananas. And they, what the Canadians eventually decide is that they will be responsible for Kurt Meyer. Because most of those German generals who are sentenced are, not most, all of them, I think, are in Europe or Britain. And so he gets sent to New Brunswick, a high security prison in Dorchester, New Brunswick. It's he doesn't fly there. They send him on a ship across the Atlantic, where apparently he was just walking amongst the group, including Canadian soldiers, talking to people, wearing a Canadian private's uniform. without badges or insignia, which I find quite shocking. And then he is facing life imprisonment in Dorchester. But there's another twist to this.
Yeah, I mean, and this is just to kind of recap that what's fascinating, and your book highlights it so well, is these Canadian officers, Vokes particularly, it's not like they've been in some staff job and then maybe he has led men in the field. He's seen war, he's seen death, and you try and explain this sort of mentality of, and you and I haven't been to war. We haven't come back from war and tried to switch off the war. And I think I always feel with this case, you kind of got to try and put yourself in the mindset of 1945, 1946, not 44, not 20 years later, in that very specific period post-war, as I said, when there's a desire to go back to normality. There's a sort of a subconscious thing. We've had enough death already. Is death the answer? It's a very unique period when things are happening. Lots of sort of I think as well, these generals have got lots of time for self-reflection. Whereas when you're making decisions on the battlefield, you don't have much time. Your staff officers say, well, it's now, or, the air cover's coming in tomorrow. We've got to do this. And you go, okay, second call goes to the left.
Yeah.
The very fact he's got time to think about this is in some ways undermining it because they're not used to that.
They're not, and you've nicely captured it. And the other part here is that they're all battlefield commanders. They've all been in combat multiple times, and they actually know what happens in combat. And Vokes, while never quite ever saying it, says something to the effect of, I can't rule out the fact that Canadian soldiers have not killed prisoners on the battlefield, which would make me responsible, which would mean that I am a war criminal. And I think that goes through a lot of their minds. Now, the distinction here, if we go back 20 minutes ago, is this was a day later. This is not in the heat of battle. But I'd love to hear from some of your watchers here, just the thoughts on that, because a lot hinges on that idea. Now, just to maybe finish off the story here to get to some of these questions. Everyone expects Meyer to rot in this prison. He's actually quite a model prisoner. He doesn't like being there. He actually writes to his son, I'm with criminals and murderers. I don't belong here. I should be with the other German generals in 46, 47, 48. Bizarrely, Paul, we all have these strange connections in our lives. I was telling this story to my neighbor. She came back a week later and said her dad was a prison guard at Dorchester around this time, and in fact knew Kurt Meyer and would occasionally see him in the library. So these interesting connections. What's also happening here, and you nicely captured it before, is the Cold War, of course, right? So we know that the Soviets are fast becoming the enemy. If we just think of 49 with NATO and the Soviets getting the bomb and the loss of China and the Korean War in June of 1950, there's a lot happening here. Germany has been partitioned, broken apart, two countries. We need West Germany. They're the buffer zone. And the West Germans are coming back into the Western fold for all kinds of reasons. One of the things they've increasingly asked for is for their generals to be returned to German soil and ultimately to be freed. Now, Meyer is across the Atlantic, but the Canadians are feeling this pressure, and the Germans are exerting this on them, not through NATO, but through other associations. And the Canadian cabinet, the government of the day is led by Louis Saint-Laurent. They begin to discuss this because they don't really know what's happening. And interestingly, they asked their top general, who is at this point Guy Simonds, Lieutenant General Guy Simonds. Simonds seems to have read the court transcripts very quickly, and he advises the cabinet that the trial was unfair. And we don't quite know why he did that, except to say that he was uncomfortable with the idea of holding generals to account for what their soldiers did. And there's other pressure going on here, but we need to understand this is the Cold War. West Germany has some cards. And in October of 51, Kurt Meyer is basically snuck out of the country, flown to Wirral, the British-run prison where Kesselring and Nanstein are there, and reunited. And he's supposed to be there for life. 3 years later, he is let out. And this becomes another round of anger in Canada and talk of what is the debt to those executed Canadians, and have we forgotten them? It was only 10 years ago. Especially Meyer, who returns to Germany as a hero. He later becomes an apologist for the SS. And this is the kicker, and maybe we'll end it here. He becomes a beer salesman to NATO troops. And on occasion, he would sell beer to the Canadians who were.
I know. When I found that out, like 50,
yeah.
I was like, I mean, it's ironic, but it's the only thing you can kind of do is like smiling, like a twisted. I mean, it's awful, but it's like
you just couldn't write it. I mean, the twists and turns here, but it ties in, I think, nicely, and I'll leave it here in case there are some questions or comments.
Yeah, there are a few.
It ties in, of course, to your larger idea of war crimes and war trials and the complexity here, no easy answers, understanding in the context of the time. I think there are lessons here to today, and responsibility of soldiers and commanders and officers. It also ties into the memory of the war over time. But maybe I'll just leave it there. Happy to engage in any discussions. Thanks, Paul, for the back and forth. I enjoyed this. It's fun.
We've got some more questions. I mean, and the irony is that he even came back to Normandy to visit the battlefields, and Jacques Vico, the caretaker of the Abbaye, sort of saw him there in like 1959, 1960, and told me and others that he kind of confronted him and said, "What are you doing back here?" And he said, "I'm just visiting the battlefields." And when anyone mentioned the crime, he said, "Oh, it was war. It was that," which is what he's been saying essentially 15 years earlier. Because 1961 he died of illness. And I'm not someone to wish an illness on anybody, but it's like Piper, we discussed, being allegedly killed by the former French resistance in 76 in France. I mean, he didn't live a long life, which I suppose is a good thing, although I'm not that kind of person.
Yeah.
But we've got some questions there. So, you mentioned this, but Adam asked about the Cold War effect. I mean, that's the thing from 45, 46, when these things are happening, even 12 months, 18 months later, the Cold War has moved on several steps further, and you get that with the Piper and the Sepp Dietrich cases we talked about last week on the channel. There's now deals being done, there's a situation afoot, and so on. So you've just addressed that absolutely is the situation. How is public, you talked about the Canadians generally, but we had a question from Fraser. How vocal were the families of the Canadian soldiers who were murdered? I mean, because I'm assuming the press was interested in their views on Kurt Meyer's release. That would have been a great coup to get, the widow of one of these guys and her to say, "I think it's despicable."
Yeah. I went through a lot of the coverage, and I was hoping to find that too. And sometimes as a historian, of course, you don't find what you think you're going to find. Yeah. The families, they're rarely talked about. Now, veterans groups, the Royal Canadian Legion, or what will become that, the Canadian Legion at the time, is vocally against this, as you would expect. There's all kinds of great letters to the Canadian cabinet from groups like steelworkers and miners, which I assume are filled with veterans. I mean, that just makes sense, right? So they are writing in anger, but not from the family members. And one of the things that struck me was how young many of these executed Canadians were. Likely they did not have wives or kids. So yes, it's elderly parents, and maybe they were not easy to find. This is not the age of the internet, is it? So what we do find is a lot of anger towards the Canadian government, where people rightly say, to come back to that first question from Adam, you are caving here. You should not be doing this. They're not pointing it's the Cold War, but they're just saying you have betrayed these Canadians. I think it's the Cold War element. And you have to conclude that the Canadian cabinet was willing to sell out or sacrifice the interests of these 18 Canadians or the 156 Canadians for the sake of Cold War politics. Now, that's a harsh statement. I don't think there's any other way to look at it. And maybe someone would say, "Tim, you're naive. Are you really saying that West Germany could not be accommodated in this way?" Well, those are two separate things, I would suggest.
I mean, it's the whole, it's Operation Paperclip, it's Von Braun, it's
Yeah.
the rocket program,
Yeah.
it's the dealing, it's all that stuff that is in some ways peripheral to this conversation, but actually it's integral to it as well. It's because when I set about to do this, it's I'll just cover the war crimes, but the spider's web of the effects of it and the influences. When do you stop? But we had a fantastic question from Gary. About one fundamental that can be never considered at the trials is whether these Nazis genuinely regretted their actions. I mean, that there were a couple of Japanese guys who seemed to break down and said they'd done wrong, but most of them were just staunch, no, doing that. And it's more or less, I mean, with people like Piper, with Meyer, they don't seem to show any ounce of regret. Of anything, even just being in the war, let alone specific crimes.
No, and after the war, years later, Meyer writes a memoir, I think in 1957, which is, very much about his success on the battlefield, of which we will not take that away from him. He was a good soldier, clearly. But he basically all but sneers at the Canadians as whiners and saying that the war is horrible, battle is very tough, and these things happen. And of course, he fought for SS to be recognized as with other forms of rights. So he never regretted it, never publicly in any way. In those dark nights, perhaps, but I just don't think so. It wasn't in his character, and that tells us something.
And I think I find it very complicated when I think of the mid-management Nazis, the guys in charge of the railways and that kind of process with the death camps that are never anywhere near the people they're murdering. It's all done by the shuffling of papers. And when I'm with a group in OT or Buran and I talk about the battle, and they say it's despicable what he does. So no, lying in ambush for the enemy, we would have done exactly the same thing. If the situation had been reversed and the Canadians were holding the Caen area and the Germans were landing, they would have sprung the same trap if they had done, because that's just war. You can, as you say, you can respect for that. He just did what a good combat soldier did. It's the second half of the story where, as we've discussed, he just drags these guys back in a very premeditated way. Shoots them in the back of the head. So we had a very good point of Edward Green, author. I think Tim's point is crucial. The 30 minutes after capture are repeatedly described as the most dangerous, particularly in instances such as an ambusher's surrendering. I think that's something, when I've spoken to veterans, that moment your best mate Billy's just been shot by an MG42 in that hedgerow over there, you run up there and the guy who just shot Billy throws his hands up. Getting through that moment and not wanting as a human being who's witnessed the death of a friend to not just dispatch that guy, because he's technically not a prisoner yet. He's in the process of becoming a prisoner, and that's very murky. And I find that very difficult to. People, Ron Spears of Easy Company came up in the sidebar. Is he a war criminal? And you go, well, probably.
Yeah,
he's on the
gray
line
zone.
Somewhere.
Right? The gray zone. Nobody tells you how to surrender on a battlefield. That's not good part of basic training. And yet every soldier has a sense of what they're supposed to do. Throw your hands up, drop your weapon, show pictures of your wife and kids. You're trying to humanize yourself to the enemy.
Yeah.
But even then, there are so many factors that can lead to the killing of that prisoner, or maybe another way to say it, the refusal to take that person prisoner. Is it 10 seconds? 10 minutes, 30 minutes. There's no number because it's, it's not quantifiable. It's a qualitative thing. One of the things that struck me, Paul, as you know, I'm a scholar of the two world wars. I used to always read about Germans on the Western Front in 16 and 17. And, they're all in a dugout and some guy throws down a grenade and 50 guys come up. And I always thought, isn't it weird that the 50 guys were down there? Because that's not a good place to be on the battlefield. You would think you want to be out firing and at least dying in a trench. They're down there to escape those first waves coming over them with blood in their eyes and seeking to do real harm, right? They're waiting for secondary forces to mop them up and hopefully not kill them. And it's a little different in Normandy because we don't have the same deep dugouts and stuff, but there were still places to hide where you were hoping to allow for a cooling off period to give yourself a bit of a buffer. And yet, even then, we know that it doesn't always work. But I do think that we are talking a different thing here, which is why the case was about the 18 Canadians executed at the Abbaye de Ardennes and not the full 156.
Yeah.
Many of whom were killed in the heat of battle, war crime or not. Much harder to prove, though, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So to kind of begin to wrap things up, because you write about the past, but you write about the influence of the past on the present and indeed the future. And that's one of the reasons we all love your work so much, because I think we can all agree that there's this bad taste in our mouths that we don't feel proper justice was served in this case. I think we can all agree that it doesn't seem fair that he only did a few years in prison. Not that necessarily that the death penalty is the answer, because as a human being, I'm not in favor of the death penalty, but I think some sort of longer sentence would have been better. But at the same time, this idea that the Canadians, like the Americans in all the war crimes trials, and the British, we did our best. You did your best to follow due process. You did your best to be fair, not to act in a vengeful way, to act on the side of a basic human good. Is that kind of where you sit with this?
I do, although it is certainly one of the most ethically challenging aspects of history that I've engaged with. I mean, think of some of the other ones. Bomber Command. I am firmly in favor of smashing German war machines and cities, and I've written about that. I don't see much moral ambiguity there in a total war. It's really difficult to think even of another situation like this. And because I've written about First World War killing of prisoners, and I've written about the Canadians who killed prisoners, and I tried to explain how and why it happened. And I had all the evidence from the soldiers themselves. They're in their letters and diaries, and they talk very openly about it. This is a case, I think you have to say, proper justice was not served, death penalty or not. But the release of Meyer in 1951 back to the prison in Europe, and then his release in 1954. I think you have to some degree, it shakes a little bit of our sense of this good war, or the necessary war, as I called it. Whatever war you want to call the Second World War. It is without a doubt a war that had to be won. It's a war that had to be fought. Canadians, British, and others generally understood that at the time, and we understand it even to this day, putting aside a few people who try to make moral arguments about various things. But I think you also have to say there are a lot of complexities in there, and then this is a case where sometimes you hear that phrase that the poor bloody infantry or the soldier at the front end or the sharp end, they are the pawns of war. And it certainly feels in a bit like this case. I don't believe that in most cases. I believe strong sense of agency. I believe soldiers know why they are fighting or why they're engaged in it. But this one, like you said, leaves a bad taste in the mouth. And what also happened because of this is the Canadians did not pursue any other war crimes. They had others that they were interested in. None were as prominent as Kurt Meyer, but they were gutted by this, MacDonald and his team of prosecutors. And they basically went back to their civilian lives. And so there are other kind of knock-on effects here as well. But I think you have to view this, that the Canadian soldiers who were murdered on the 7th and 8th of June, justice was not done.
Do you think there's any connection between maybe a sense of what was it all for among Canadian veterans, particularly the officers, perhaps some of them were still serving, and this sort of cynical era of the Canadians writing about their war experience in the 60s and 70s, the valor and the horror kind of thing, where putting yourselves down, it was all a big tragedy, all a bit of waste, again, which you talk about in your book there. Is there any direct connection, do you think, between the reaction to Meyer's trial and the growing sort of cynical aspect that we're out of it now? People like yourself and David O'Keefe and Mark Zelkin, all this, you're writing about Canada's kick-ass role in World War II and what you contributed, but there was this period where there was a bit of almost embarrassment and knocking everything. Is there a connection?
I think there is. It's not anything you could prove in a direct, oh, here's a document from somebody saying this, right? But I think it creates to that sense of malaise, the sense that we had done our bit during the war and we had done it well, but let's leave it behind us. And that's part of a larger story of not building separate Second World War monuments, of looking forward and not backwards, not creating documentaries, never being a proper war film. Very few memoirs published during this period. Now, there are other factors. Canada's a small country, largely. We get dwarfed by the American story, as does everybody. And so it contributes to it, I think. But yes, I would say it's part of that spectrum. It's really hard to sort out in my head, and I tried in this book and others, of why we focused on defeat. Think of Dieppe and its prominent place, as opposed to victory, largely Normandy and the liberation of the Dutch and other contributions. Maybe that's something about the Canadian character and other elements, and that's a whole different show. Maybe we'll talk about that again at some point. But I do think it's a part of that, and certainly the idea of let's leave the war behind is driving this quite a bit, isn't it? Insofar as we need to look to the future, and the future is a Cold War where we need West Germany in the front lines and ready to fight. And there was even talk of maybe Kurt Meyer coming back as a German commander, in the West German armed forces fighting the communists. What would that have looked like to Canadians? I don't know. But it did not happen.
Yeah, and I think just to round things up, I think there's still this debate about whether or not, military staff rides are still worth it because, wars have changed and drones and aircraft carriers, things like that. But, when people like yourself who are teaching as well, is that maybe whether or not the Second Corps in 1917 did the right thing in this battle is a little bit more abstract now, 100 years on. But justice and the right to due process, the right to be to be held accountable for your crimes, to be tried for your crimes, and to have some kind of process, that is still absolutely relevant right now. So if nothing else, the Meyer case can be used as an example, and imperfect as all these war crimes trials that we're dealing with. They're all a bit fuzzy. None of them seem to feel like, those TV movies where criminal is brought to court and there's a big thing there and he's found guilty and you can go, hooray! The murderer's in jail.
You can't handle the truth.
These ones always have this. It doesn't quite work out the way. But as I said, to reinforce what I said, I think that is the clunky nature of democracy. That's the clunky nature of trying to do things the right way. Is that in trying to be good, maybe you're not completely objective.
History is messy, partially because what happens is messy, and the evidence from the past is unclear and fractured and fragmented. And I do like what you said there, Paul, about that this is still probably a lesson that the Canadian Armed Forces and other professional armed forces would read and study with great profit, because there are great discussions that fall out of this, and they may just be discussions, right? There may not be a final answer, but in having those discussions, I have found that is part of this process of better understanding both what happens on the battlefield and the fact that the things that happen on the battlefield are not left there. They come back in many ways and forms and legacies. And we are still talking about this 80 plus years later. Yeah.
And you need these benchmark cases where there is an individual accused of a specific thing that you can examine, because, we mustn't forget there are war crimes and atrocities occurring right now in various places around the world where it's a bit harder to maybe pin down the blame on an individual, because it's more, it's larger scale, and even going back to Cambodia 30, 40 years ago, it's maybe harder to find the exact person responsible. But when you have a case like this where the without trivializing it, the dog is sitting behind a pile of poo in the kitchen. You know the pile of poo is there. You know the dog did it, and the dog is looking at the pile of poo. That's what we have with Kurt Meyer. We know there's no question that he didn't do it or he didn't order it. It's just that process of making sure you can build a case and justice served. Anyway, we will carry these conversations on with other historians over the next few weeks. In the meantime, Tim, it's been absolutely fantastic, as it always is, talking to you. So this is the one book of Tim's I've got in my hand, but the others are on the shelf behind me. The Fight for History covers it, but the 2 volumes that precede it are also fantastic and worth reading. I will suggest you read that if you haven't already. But folks, I'm back again tomorrow. We're looking at Ilse Koch, the notorious female SS nasty person tomorrow, which I'm not looking forward to the subject matter, but I'm looking forward to the conversation. That's 2 hours earlier than normal, so check the time for that. In the meantime, everybody click like and subscribe, consider becoming a patron or channel member, and I say buy my guest books so they will keep coming back and talking to us again on World War II TV. Thanks, Tim. Thanks, everybody. See you again tomorrow. Bye.